Hey there, everybody. Welcome to Module 9. We're really getting into some metabolic biochemistry stuff here. And so let's start this way. I want to review with you some concepts that we've talked about in previous lectures. In particular, we're going to focus on the concept of work, right? And by work, we're talking about some very specifically scientific physics-related definition. And in our context, what we call cellular work can be mechanical, meaning something is moving, the way your cells are, muscle cells are moving your skeleton around would be a really good example of mechanical work. Pretty much everything you do consciously with your physical movements are all kind of like the manifestations of mechanical work taking place at a cellular level. Um, Chemical work is where you've got those chemical reactions we talked about before, where you've got reactants and their covalent bonds get rearranged. We break these covalent bonds, we form those covalent bonds, and in the process, we're ending up with a very different kind of molecule, right? And so that is another type of situation in which we could have something be work, okay? And there's also the movement of solutes from one side of a membrane to another side of the membrane. We learned all about membrane structure. You know that membranes are this nonpolar, impermeable, it's an impermeable sheet of material that blocks the passage of stuff from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell, or from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. And in order to get stuff from one side to the other, it requires some type of protein channel, okay? And that protein channel is basically carrying out some type of transport work, provided, and this is the second point right here, right? Provided it's actually chemical transport work if we're actually taking a solute out from where it's at a low concentration and pushing it into a compartment, a cellular compartment where there's a higher concentration of that solute, right? Right? When you think about transport work, you could have a membrane over here, this would be your membrane, and here's be a protein, and this protein will be responsible for taking a solute. Maybe this is going to be the solute over here, a solute X, right? And the solute is going to be moving in this direction from the left side of the membrane to the right side of the membrane. And so this is the movement of the solute through the protein channel. Now, it's work if there's a low concentration on the left and a high concentration on the right, right? Because that's something that's not going to happen for free. You don't expect things to move in a direction away from osmotic or equilibrium. The natural universe always wants the system to go to an endpoint where you've got equal concentrations on both sides of the membrane. And that's going to be happening if the movement was from right to left, right? You know, this direction would be work, right? This direction, from high to low, this would be non-work. Even though at kind of like a superficial level, you might say, well, they're very similar. We're moving a solute from one side of the membrane to the other. No, that's not enough to make it work, okay? Transport work occurs, one, if it's movement of material from one side of the membrane to another, and two, if it's actually going in a direction against the concentration gradient, right? Okay, so I guess what I want you to review here is the concepts of what these different kinds of work could be. What would be an example of chemical work versus chemical non-work? What did you do? You think, oh, well, dehydration synthesis is a good example of chemical work because it's endergonic, whereas hydrolysis, like making monosaccharides from two disaccharides making two monosaccharides from a disaccharide by breaking it apart, that would be chemical non-work because we don't require to throw energy at the process. It yields energy, and therefore it doesn't require an input of an energy source, right? Mechanical work, lifting your arm off the table would definitely require some energy to be thrown at your skeletal muscle to lift your forearm up. Okay, allowing your forearm to flop back on the table. That does not technically require work. I mean, there might be some work going on as you're preventing your arm from flopping down. If you're actually breaking your fall, that's going to definitely be requiring some mechanical work, right? But simply falling down, allowing gravity to move your body toward a lower position, a lower energy state, that would be mechanical movement, but it would not be mechanical work, okay? So I mean, this is a really important place to start. If we have non-work, that's kind of like the end of our discussion. We don't need to account for what is powering that reaction forward. It's a reaction that doesn't need to be powered forward because it's exergonic, right? It's these reactions that are endergonic, right? That are the ones that require energy. And so this is where ATP is going to be coming in a really big way. Okay? Another concept that I like to use, it's a metaphor, but it's getting at the idea of an uphill reaction is one where you're going in this direction. This is a hill. If you're pushing a car in the direction up the hill, oops, draw. Sorry about that. Pushing a car up the hill, that's obviously not going to be happening for free. This is why we call the endergonic processes uphill reactions. You have to provide an energy source to see a car be pushed up the hill. Whereas if you get past the top of the hill and the car is going downwards, you obviously do not need to throw any energy at that. So here's the car. It's kind of hard to draw. Talk at the same time. So here's the car. Yeah, I know it looks like it's got a flat tire, but pretend it doesn't have that look, right? So for the car to move down the hill on the other side, we don't need to put any gas into the car. We don't need to rev the engine, wear the battery down of your Tesla if it's a Tesla. This is something that's going to be happening for free. This would be an exergonic reaction. Right. And so this is just some notation for you. If I or any other teacher refers to a downhill reaction, what we really mean is that this is a reaction that does not require an energy source because it's exergonic. There's actually a net yield of energy going from the reactant side to the product side. Right? Now here's the thing. Okay, and this is kind of like a theme of your textbook. I'll switch over to the textbook now. Okay. Chemical reactions either release or store energy. Okay, we've actually seen chapter 5, section 11 before. And we said, well, sometimes the reactants have a greater level energy than the products. So this here, you figure 5.11a, would this be an uphill reaction or would it be a downhill reaction? Well, downhill, right? Because the reactants are at a higher energy state than the product, and energy is released when we go from reactant to product. We don't need to throw any energy into this reaction, make it move forward. This would be a downhill reaction. And the other kind of reaction was an uphill reaction where you have to throw energy in. It's like pushing the car up the hill. Okay, it's not going to happen unless you put some energy into it. And so this is kind of like what we mean by an uphill reaction, right? So endergonic reactions are uphill. And the thing that we're learning here is that generally the rule is that downhill reactions are the things that will always be providing the energy required to drive uphill reactions when they occur in a cell, right? And so this is happening, like millions of times per second, billions of times per second in each and every cell in your body, right? These uphill reactions, these endergonic examples of mechanical work, chemical work, transport work, they're needed all the time, 24/7. Okay? Your cell is carrying out these forms of work, and in order to make them happen, we need to expend energy, or we need to harness the energy of downhill reactions to cause the driving forward of these reactions that are required to keep our cells alive, right? And now, as it turns out, maybe the most important downhill reaction that we discuss in a biology class is the breakdown of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, right? With 3 phosphates to 2 phosphates. And what is changed is that we're breaking off a phosphate group, okay? Now, so we would call this ATP consumption. You could also call it a hydrolysis reaction. Hydrolysis of ATP into ADP and phosphate. Okay, so phosphate is a P with a subscript, should be a subscript lowercase I. Okay? And so one thing that you're not saying here is that, well, ATP was there in the beginning, water molecule was there in the beginning. Okay, so this is actually a hydrolysis reaction, and as a result of breaking this apart, the water is split apart, and half goes on to ADP and half goes on to the phosphate. But this reaction, ATP on the left-hand side, arrow forward, ADP and phosphate, is a super important downhill reaction. It's a super important reaction in a biology class because this is how a huge number of endergonic reactions are taking place, right? This is the reaction, downhill reaction that we're coupling in order to drive the mechanical movement of muscle fibers relative to each other. They're used to drive, it's the same reaction used to drive the synthesis of polysaccharide from monosaccharide. This is also used to drive the transport of many different solutes across membranes. Okay, so yeah, definitely remember that particular reaction because it's an important one. Okay, can't stress this enough. You need to get your mind around that, right? Now, it's not the only downhill reaction. In fact, we talked earlier, I think it was in lecture 8C, we talked about how transport work, moving a solute from a low concentration to a high concentration, it could happen if we couple that transport with a transport of something down a gradient. In other words, we talked about how co-transport would be coupling a downhill reaction where one solid is moving from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, and that is pulling along another solute that is moving from a lower concentration to a higher concentration. Okay, so I'm not saying that it's the only downhill reaction that's important. There are other downhill reactions that could be used. But I am saying that it is maybe the most important, the most widely used source of energy. Okay? And in a sense, what this means is that ATP is like our energy currency. It's like energy in the bank. When we have lots of ATP available, we have lots of energy available to drive my cellular work reactions. But there's only a certain amount of ATP that can be there in the cell, right? And with all of these endergonic reactions requiring ATP to drive them forward, it's not going to take long. It'll only be a second or so for all of the cell's ATPs to get used up, right? And if we use up all the ATP and all we have is ATP and phosphate, that would not be good because ATP and phosphate is not going to be a source of energy. And so here we come to the second half of this lesson, which is the idea that, well, yeah, now that we understand that ATP hydrolyzed into ADP and phosphate is a downhill reaction that all cells need, and we need this ATP stuff in vast amounts. Okay? we also need to remake. We need all the ATP that gets used up has got to be restored, and so we need to recycle the ADP and phosphate and put that phosphate group back onto ADP so that we have more ATP to use later on. Okay, this should make sense. You can't just consume the ATP. You also have to generate ATP. And these are what we call the fueling reactions. Okay. And we're learning about them. The two that we feature in BIO110 are cellular respiration. We do this in a big way. We mentioned briefly photosynthesis. We do it in a pretty minor way. It's not really fair. I mean, photosynthesis is actually a far more interesting process than cellular respiration because there's a lot of variations that could be happening. But this being a course that is kind of directed towards clinical people of clinical interest, very few of you are going to become plant doctors and nurses. Most of you are going to be ending up working on some type of animal, and animals just don't do photosynthesis. Right? That's, to me, that's the only reason why we tend to focus on cellular respiration more than we do photosynthesis. In my view, photosynthesis is a far more important process than cellular respiration because this is happening on a far greater scale worldwide at any given time in the entirety of the Earth's history, very few exceptions. And well, okay, but anyways, all right. Fueling reactions say that we need to make ATP from ADP and phosphate. Okay. Another way of saying this is that we are phosphorylating. Okay? Phosphorylation means we're attaching another phosphate group onto this thing, right? So we're phosphorylating ADP, and consequently we get ATP. We go from a diphosphate stage to a triphosphate stage. Okay? So here's my little quiz question for you. This reaction, ADP and phosphate giving rise to ATP, is this an uphill reaction or a downhill reaction? Yeah, okay. I mean, I just said that the reaction ATP to ADP and phosphate is an important downhill reaction. And if this is our downhill reaction, we're making ADP from ADP and phosphate, the reverse reaction is going to have to be uphill, right? Okay. And so here's the thing, right? This uphill reaction would need to be driven by a downhill reaction, right? And so I guess now we're thinking on a completely different level, right? At the cellular level, we know that we've got a whole bunch of uphill reactions that are driven by the conversion of ATP into ADP and phosphate. Good, no worries, no sweat. The other half says that, and this is where we're at right now, is that we can't just have that happen. We also have to have another set of reactions that are going to restore the ATP by coupling the phosphorylation of ADP with other downhill reactions. And this might either be the breakdown of food, catabolism of food, conversion of sugar into CO2 and water, okay? Like waste, right? Or in the case of photosynthesis, you've got solar energy that's driving a chemical reaction that leaves us with another loaded spring. That's like you end up with a highly energetic reaction that can move forward spontaneously and thus driving the synthesis of ATP. Right? And so this little pep talk should prepare you for what's coming up next. What I want you to be able to do as a result of having done this lecture is to completely understand why it is we're talking about cellular respiration. What does cellular respiration do? Well, it generates ATP. Why do we need ATP? Well, we need it to drive cellular work reactions. Right? Now, in the next lecture, we'll be talking about catalysts, in particular enzymes, which are the important catalysts that we typically have in living systems. Right? See you soon.